Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Saltmarshe. I am the co-founder of the Comms Lab, and I am going to be your host for the rest of this afternoon. So my session is called Why Reframe, and I wanted to start by talking about why are we all here? Why have we put on this event? And over the last few days, when I was thinking about what I was going to say in this section, I realised that the reason that I'm here is because of the urgency of the now. And part of me really didn't want to start this talk talking about the urgency of the now, because I've been going to environmental conferences for the last 20 years, and everyone starts with someone standing on stage telling us how urgent things are. But right now, it is an incredibly motivating force for me as we approach 2020. So when I started off in this movement almost 20 years ago, 2020 was the date when so many of our dreams would be fulfilled. It was a date of so many targets that we were aiming for. And as that date hurtles towards us now, it's leaving me very reflective about where we're at. And I think you, of all audiences, know how much is at stake right now. You know about what a critical moment this is for the future of the planet and all the species on it. And you know very well about this kind of diminishing window of opportunity that we have to safeguard that. And I know increasingly in our external communications, we are very positive about the future. But I think those of us who've been working in the sector for decades, like in our hearts, we know how much is at stake right now. And we know the scale of the challenge that we face. And to kind of address that challenge, we need to scale up our work. And I think that might be why there are so many of you in this room today, is because I think all of us know that we need to start scaling up the collective impact that we have, and work in ways that are bigger than any one message, bigger than any one campaign, bigger than any one organisation. And that's where things get exciting, because suddenly we are at a moment when we have the tools, the precedents, the technology, the understanding of human psychology that enables us to work in a new way, that enables us to work to achieve a much more widespread impact. And so today is really about looking at pioneers who are doing this work that's about changing cultural narratives and particularly working with culture to change those narratives. And one of the things that we're seeing is an increasing understanding that this work around changing narratives is foundational. Like, for a long time, we treated narrative and story as if it was an add-on. So it would be like you do the real work and then you go and tell stories about it. And there is an increasing understanding that actually these narratives that surround the issues we all work on are foundational. They are the operating system. They are the soil from which everything else grows. And so if we want to achieve wide-scale social and environmental change, we need to be working at this foundational level. So I'm really excited about today, where we are going to be looking at pioneering work from different sectors. But the whole idea of today is that it gives you, the people who are literally saving the world on a daily basis, that it gives you more tools to do your work with. That's what today's about. It's about enabling you to reflect on your work. I know you all are incredibly busy and it's really hard to find time to gain new perspectives. So we hope that there will be time today for you to reflect on what some of what you're hearing means for your work, but also for you to meet each other. As we're going to discover, this work is profoundly collaborative. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what framing is. So let's see if this works. Yes. So we seem to be in the middle of a reframing revolution. Over the last few years, we're seeing an increasing number of framing projects happening on subjects like criminal justice, homelessness, poverty, the oceans. And the reason that this is happening is because there is a growing understanding of how foundational framing is, about how this work of framing sits underneath all of our campaign messages. The way that I like to think of it is that frames are the soil from which everything grows. So if we don't do the framing work, it's like throwing your campaign seed out onto an arid desert. Whereas if we've done the framing work, it's like throwing your campaign seed into fertile soil. So the reason we need to think about framing at all is because as humans, we aren't particularly rational creatures. In fact, we're very messy and emotional. The truth won't necessarily set us free. We won't even necessarily act in our own self-interest. The rational human is about as real as a leprechaun. But I don't know about you, but like when I started off in my career in campaigning, I used to think, oh, if only I could just make enough people understand how bad things really are, if I could make enough people understand the facts, then they will change what they think and they'll change how they behave and it'll all be all right. So that was how I started off campaigning. And yet, we cannot rely on rationality alone. We have to work on much deeper emotional and cognitive levels because of the fact that we are messy, irrational beings. And that's where framing work comes in. So frames, what frames actually are these mental shortcuts in our heads. So we live in this kind of crazy complex world, we can't possibly make sense of it all with our conscious brain, and so we've developed all these heuristics, all these kind of mental shortcuts to help us deal with the complexity of the world. And so a frame is essentially a neural pathway that gets strengthened through use. So I like to think of it like a path through a field that gets strengthened by walking on it. Every time you use a frame, you make that neural pathway stronger. And as we're going to explore, even if you use a frame to contest it, you will still be making that neural pathway stronger through using it. So the way that frames live in the world is through language and metaphor. So similarly, if we want to reverse engineer certain frames, we need to work on the level of language and metaphor. And so I thought I'd give an example of this with the bad apple metaphor. So say this afternoon, whilst all the speakers are doing their thing, I go off and go to the reptile house and set all the snakes free. And after the chaos and the bells that we've just heard about have rung, and they've got all the snakes back, and they've kind of freed the last boa constrictor from the coffee machine, they'll probably do something with me, they'll put me somewhere, and someone will come out and make an announcement, maybe someone from the zoo, and they'll say, really sorry about that, don't worry everybody, it's okay, we've looked Ella up, she was just a bad apple, you don't need to worry, it's not going to happen again. But the problem with that metaphor, well, the thing about that metaphor is it's so powerful because a bad apple taps into a really deeply held purity and pollution frame that we have. So we will literally, we'll hear the phrase bad apple, and we'll kind of exhale in relief because we'll be like, oh yeah, I understand. Problem solved, that makes sense, we're safe from the snakes now. Actually, for me to have gone to set free all those snakes, there would have had to be a whole load of systemic failures. And the metaphor, a bad apple, stops us looking for those systemic solutions because we think it's already sorted. And so that's just an example of how, like, one metaphor, two words, can actually stop us looking for any systemic solutions for a problem. So that's how powerful language can be. Now, we might go away from today and think, okay, that's all well and good, but actually I don't really want to work on the level of framing. The problem is, even if we don't do the framing work, other people will. So I'd like to introduce you to Frank Luntz. This man might look like a bit of a cuddly teddy bear. He is actually a lethal right-wing political operative in the US. And he is responsible for many of the phrases that you see here. He has been working hard over the last 20 years to reframe environmental issues in a way that is definitely not beneficial to the sector. And the problem with framing is, as I mentioned before, like every time we use a frame, even if it's to counter it, we strengthen it. So George Lakoff, who is one of the leading academics in the space in the US, has an exercise he does where he asks his students, he tells them to don't think of an elephant. We all think of an elephant, right? And what he's showing there is that even when we use a frame to contest it, we still strengthen it. So my point here is that if we don't do the framing work, the space is going to be occupied by others who will. So, how do we do this? So when I have been trying to make sense of this process, I put together this diagram. I put this together for myself at first, just to understand how it all worked. And where this work starts is really by understanding the language and framing that's already there around the issues that we work on. It is about doing listening, researching, understanding what people are already saying. The next phase is about developing new frames in that language. Then we need to test those frames and language, that's super important. And then finally, we need to mobilize them. So if we don't do this work, basically you will have the world's most expensive PowerPoint. You will have invested all this work in understanding frames and developing new ones, but unless they live in the world, they're useless. And if we go back to this image, you remember a frame is a pathway that's strengthened through using it, which means that we want it to be strengthened in a multiplicity of ways. And so today is really exciting because we have got speakers who are going to talk from across this spectrum. So the first half of the day, we're really going to be focusing on this far side. We're going to be hearing from people who are diving into the practice of framing, looking at the research, and then looking at how you create new frames. The second part of the afternoon is going to be focused on how do you mobilize those frames out into the world. And the way that we're going to be working is that we really wanted today to do three things. We wanted you to be able to experience as many different perspectives as possible, but we also wanted it to be participative. We wanted this to be a chance for you to chew things over, to discuss, to make sense of what you're hearing. And then finally, we want it to be a place for you to meet others. And so the way that we're structuring it is that we're going to have 4 speakers who each have got 10 minutes to talk about what they're doing, and then we're going to break out. Each speaker is going to have a set of 2 tables at the back of the room, and you will have 30 minutes to have longer conversations with the speakers about their work, and we really want this to be as participative as possible. There'll be a coffee break, then we're going to do the same thing again, but this time looking at this work that's about mobilizing frames. And then finally, we are going to make sense of it all over alcohol. We've got the space and drinks until 7:30. So at the very back of the room, there is a poster. So we've got this diagram on a poster. And what we'd love you to do is to populate that with examples that you know of work that's already happening. We want to start to map what's going on in this space, so do get busy with post-its and the notes. So I think that's basically everything I've got to say. I guess the only final thing is standing looking at you all, is just to acknowledge the collective power in this room today. Between you all, between us, there is a lot of power in this room. And I think today is really about how do we collaborate? How do we leverage this collective power so that we can have more collective impact about the issues that we are working on? So, on that note, I am very excited to introduce our first speaker. So the first speaker is Nikki Hawkins. Nikki is the UK lead at the Frameworks Institute. Frameworks have been pioneering work in this space for the last 20 years. And I'm really excited to invite her onto the stage. Thank you.